As long listeners of this show might know, Venice Beach has had a long and weird past. It was once the marshy and swampy dump, and it would have remained so if Abbott Kinney hadn't won
I don't know why they changed the name.
It would have stayed that way if he hadn't won a coin toss and selected the dump over the picturesque Santa Monica.
Right.
His dream for Dagobah, California was to create a postcard dreamland here on the West Coast. He turned the marshes into canals where people would take gondola rides. He designed amusement piers and boardwalks. You can go to the beach in Santa Monica or Palos Verdes, but only in Venice could you walk into a dream.
Right.
It was like pre-Disneyland, sort of like you're in a fantasy area right now.
There's alligators.
Yeah.
The alligators are loose.
This area drew in a different crowd, creatives and dreamers. But of course, history happened. Oil was discovered nearby, and nightmare steel towers robbed Venice of the view. The amusement piers either burned down or just were left to decay because of like the ocean air just decayed everything, basically. The canals were unloved and became filthy puddles of wet trash. The area became sketchy, riddled with crime and homelessness. Even now, I often say if you want to see someone in the middle of being arrested, head over to the Venice Boardwalk and you'll see someone in the middle of being arrested. But nevertheless, the creatives still found Venice to be a homing beacon for other like-minded weirdos too shaky for Santa Monica. So that's just quick sum up for anybody who doesn't know too much about Venice.
It's Los Angeles' Greenwich Village. Cafe Wa. Young West Coast Bob Dylan got his start here.
Unfortunately, it was Donovan. Meanwhile, post-war America was spitting up a new literary style that young hip people thought was cool, daddy-o, but had normal people thinking, this is bad, this writing is indulgent and misogynistic. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Gregory Corso, Gary Snyder would be poets and writers who would be at the forefront of the bebop jazz-inspired coffee house-infesting beat generation. They rejected the traditional forms of pretty much everything: American culture, capitalism, writing, literary formalities, romantic relationships. They were radically new in a way that shocked older generations. And while I do enjoy most of what the beats are about, they seem to think women are playthings, and the whole movement spawned hippies and pop folk music. So those are some unforgivable acts that were committed.
Wait, you don't like pop folk?
You don't like the mamas and the papas? You don't like the birds? No.
Tell me this is an April Fool.
So there was two established base camps. On the East Coast, the beats thrived at Greenwich Village. On the West Coast, North Beach in San Francisco was the beat scene. And that was kind of the two home bases.
Right.
Southern California was left, being seen as the home of wealthy Hollywood elites and dreamland. So nobody really cared. It was like put aside. How can a young new culture exist in such a phony place? I bet they don't even read books in Los Angeles. I'd love it if I could say, oh yeah, but the Venice beat scene of the late 50s was pretty vapid and amounted to almost nothing. Because by the time the Venice West scene had developed, the beat generation hype had reached its parody stage by the time our scene started to come into fruition.
Okay, so we were like the incense and peppermints of
Kind of.
poetry.
Kind of, yeah. I know what you're talking about. Poet, jazz, freewheeling characters had worked their way into popular culture. So you'd see white poets dressed like Dizzy Gillespie, the beret and the goatee. You'd see them in TV shows or movies or comic strips or cartoons. It became like an archetype. Beatniks became shorthand for pretentious, starving artists with their own shorthand slang and dress style. The true beats had moved on from that scene they created, and the posers took their place. This happened just as the West Coast beat scene woke up.
As we say all the time, you want to be the first or the third.
third,
You
yeah.
don't want to be...
This scene is very the second.
Yeah. What would the third? There's the original beat poets, the Venice beat scene. What is the third that perfected it?
I mean...
Kurt Cobain?
If you go logically, time-wise, it would be the hippies that took over the Sunset Strip kind of thing, like hippies in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
If you ask me, true beatnik stuff ends up going to the mask and being punk.
Okay.
That's what I think anyways.
So it's the Stinkies and the
Stinkies and the
blood
bum bums.
bites.
Yeah, the kakas and the bum bums. Just baby words. So let's talk about the two Venice Beach beat establishments and the characters who helped put them together. The first place that opened up was on the Venice Boardwalk itself at 1501 Ocean Walk Boulevard, and it was called The Gas House, a very beatnik coffee house name. The Gas House was led by Eric.
It's now a marijuana shop.
It's now, yeah, it's coming to itself now. The prophecy
It's
foretold.
come full circle.
Yeah, come full circle.
Hey man, someday they're gonna sell marijuana
It'll be
here.
illegal, man.
Our beat poets were Cheech and Chong. The voice of a
Beatnik's
generation.
whatever you want as long as they don't have a job and they do drugs. It's just a beatnik.
Sounds like Cheech and Chong to me.
So the gas house was pretty much led by a guy named Eric Nord, not opened or operated by, but kind of just led. Like Nord was the mascot of sorts for the gas house. Eric, quote unquote, Big Daddy Nord, was a fixture of the North Beach beat scene as the owner of the coexistent bagel shop, which
What?
Okay, this is in North Beach in San Francisco.
Okay.
The bagel shop he ran was called the Coexistence Bagel Shop, and it called itself the Gateway to Beatland. So already it's like, if you're advertising it, then there's no way that it's cool or real.
Try this onion chive cream cheese, man. It'll unlock your mind.
It's like listening to Charlie Parker when you're eating this bagel.
What's in the middle, man? I don't know.
You're giving too hippie. You have to be more pretentious than that.
That's true.
Galileo.
That's true.
Plato.
Yeah.
Bagel. And then somebody's just like playing bongos, like,
That's true. I guess I can't do a beatnik.
And then they're all screaming at women. They're doing heroin and screaming at women. Eric Nord was born Henry Hillmuth Pastor in Germany and came to the U.S. in 1936, which is a pretty good time to come to the U.S. from
Yeah,
Germany.
If you're a spy.
He was an actor and kind of poet and was dubbed the King of North Beach by San Francisco columnist Herb Caen, who also came up with the term beatnik. Nord was the quintessential non-artistic beatnik hipster. He was a large dude, like 6'8", 300 pounds, bushy beard, wearing an old sea captain's hat and riding a tricycle through town, wearing sandals and shorts.
I think you might be describing Jigsaw.
He liked to play games. Like, he
Wore a lot
hated
of paint.
society.
I wish I knew anything more about
I know.
the Saw
I'm sitting here
movies.
trying to be like, oh, God.
There was like 8 of him.
Like he's in a toilet.
And one of them, they built a statue to him.
there's like
He
a
has
lady.
cancer, I think.
Oh, God, there's a lady.
Is
I know I
he-
saw the poster for that new movie and I thought, you maniacs, you blew it up.
You blow up the franchise.
Nord ran a series of coffee shops and clubs that became beat hangout spots in North Beach. The biggest one being the nightclub, the Hungry Eye.
That's still there.
Yeah, it opened in 1950. He sold it to Enrico.
You think I don't know my hippie clubs, my beat hippie clubs? You got Cafe Wa in New York. You got the Hungry Eye. You got what were the other ones?
I don't remember. And I'll tell you, I got food poisoning at every one of them.
Yeah, food poisoning from the poetry.
My body's registering this poem as poison.
I got food poisoning from the poetry and the rotten clams I ate.
And that gray egg salad sandwich. He sold the Hungry Eye to Enrico Banducci, and it became a stand-up club where Bill Cosby and Mort Saul got started.
Yeah, that's why I know it. I know it because all of these old because you know how closely I follow Bill Cosby's career.
Up to like 2012, I followed his career pretty good, and I don't know.
Lost interest. It lost me. It
Yeah.
took a weird turn.
Quite suddenly lost interest for no particular reason. Why? How come?
Jumped the shark.
And by the way, 1950 is very early in the history of the beat movement. I can't even think of, like, On the Road and Howl aren't published till much later in the decade. So by 1950, Kerouac is working on his first novel still, Town and City. So I don't know how there's a beat movement in 1950 if they haven't done Howl or On the Road yet. But according to the LA Times article about Eric Nord in 1950, he was running all these clubs. So prolific.
A pre-beat. This was the like count-in
Yeah,
for the beat.
this was the opening act.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Down here in Los Angeles now, or it's down here, along with the money from a hip young lawyer named Alphonse Matthews, who I couldn't find anything about.
What more do you need to know? He's hip young Moira.
Yeah, hip young beatnik lawyer.
Hip young lawyer, Alphonse Matthew.
That's the name of his firm. Hip young lawyer.
Welcome to HYL.
Hip and young and lawyer.
Hip and young and law.
Beatniks at law. So along with Alphonse Matthews, Big Daddy Nord found a space at Market Street and Oceanfront Walk.
This is still San Francisco.
No, this is down here.
Oh, okay.
This is down here now. Nord and Matthews open up the space. Well, I'll get to who the third person is later. I mean, the three of them found a space at Market Street and Oceanfront Walk. The building the space was attached to was old. It was either built in 1904 or 1889. I read both, and both kind of make sense in the history of Venice.
1989.
So I read both those dates in LA Times. The space had first been a fashionable drugstore, then it became a sprawling bar with 20 bartenders, which makes me think this is one of those long bars we kept joking about.
These long bars.
Long bars. After that,
A bartender every 4 feet.
great in COVID. This would have been great in COVID. After that, after the long bar, it was a bingo parlor. And then finally, the Venice area went full grime, and the space just became like a homeless wino hideaway.
Is this where they put the freak show?
Yeah, this is where they put the freak show, and it like homeless wino hideaway. Now it's a homeless wino coffee shop. That's about the time that Matthews and Big Daddy Nord found it. I read all kinds of dates, but I'm gonna go with my gut and believing this space was. They opened up the gas house in 1959, 2 years after On the Road was released, and 4 years after Howl. The gas house was envisioned as an art commune, an art center where artists could live and work and display their work and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of Venice. And for 3 years, that's basically what it was. It was a community center for beatniks. But it was more than just an art collective. Art gallery, yes. Living quarters, flop house for artists, yes. Community center, yes. But also members only coffee house and stage space. So it was kind of like
coffee house.
Yeah, I guess
That's
like
bad for business.
That's really bad for it.
Did the Beatniks not care about business all of a sudden?
How do I feel about capitalism?
Hey, one frappuccino, hold the subsidizing. Am I right?
But can I get oat milk? The Gas House was where LA Beatniks would go see poetry readings, folk music, jazz, and have lengthy, pretentious conversations on philosophy and literature. Also bongos, bongos, bongos. And for 3 years, it really...
That was my nightclub. Bongos, bongos,
bongos. Bongos, bongos, bongos.
Yeah, we played steel drums.
It was a lot of actually banjos.
Bonjos. No, that was my other club. Bonjos.
And for 3 years, it really was the scene for the West Coast beats. The small space would be full of 100 or so beatniks sipping coffee and creating art or performing. The scene also had tourists, reporters, photographers, and beatnik posers sleeping on the beach and praying to the atheist god to graduate to hanger-on. One day I hope to be a hanger-on, but for now I'm just a beatnik sleeping on the beach outside of a coffee shop where I sometimes read poetry.
What do they hang on to? What? The dying beat scene?
Yeah. So who wasn't having a hip daddy-o cool cat time was the neighbors, who heard one too many bongo jazz all-nighters and decided it was time.
Hey.
If this was going to continue...
I've been there.
You're part of the problem, Square. If this was going to continue, the Gas House would need an entertainment license, which the neighbors knew they could not get. They were in fact denied the license after a public hearing where beatniks and folk musicians with guitars failed to sway the city council. Nord and Matthews continued running the Gas House business as usual, permit or not, and they were eventually fined and given 1 year probation and 30 days. They suspended a jail term for that. After the Gas House closed in 1962, Nord fled to Maui. So the Gas House is closed. Eric Nord, Big Daddy, is gone. Now we could talk about the Venice West, the two men who represent both sides of the West Coast beat movement, and the book that documented the scene, Holy Barbarians.
I've never heard of this book. Should I have?
I mean, I knew about it. I never read it because I knew its reputation. So, like, it's okay to know about it as part of, like, LA history, but I'm not going to, like, grade you. And if you read it, I would make fun of you.
I don't know what's worse, not knowing about it or having read it.
Yeah, it depends how you look at wastes of time. For all this, we start with a frustrated writer named Lawrence Lipton. Some writers are mysterious, troubled thinkers who are eloquent and thoughtful on the page, but complete messes as people. And some people want you to think that of them. And Lipton seems to be a little bit more of the latter. He was a better hustler and talker than he was a writer, but he was a professional writer. He did write and make money from doing that. Just not an intellectual type that the Kerouac or Ginsberg were, nor was he the rough and tumble Neil Cassidy type, which was like a lot of beatniks kind of looked up to. He was a stiff and is a writer of popular items. According to John Arthur Maynard's book, Venice West, The Beat Generation of Southern California, where I got a lot of information from, Lipton was the ghostwriter for his wife. His wife was a popular crime novelist who I was very interested in. Her name is Craig Rice. That's her like pseudonym, but it was recognized that she was a female. She has like a good reputation as a crime writer. She was married to Lawrence Lipton at the time, and it's said that he wrote a majority, or they co-wrote it, but there was a certain point in her alcoholism where he was writing more than her, I think. And she was sort of just like throwing the spice on top of what made her special. He was also a professional writer in LA, penning many radio shows like Inner Sanctum, among many others. So he was like...
Now you got my attention.
I mean, like, to me, writing crime novels and horror radio shows is top tier. I think that's like the coolest thing. But not to Lipton, who wanted to be seen as a writer. Through his life, he had several careers. He had tried graphic arts and won some awards, then moved on to journalism and became a regular contributor to the New York Jewish newspaper, The Forverts. It sounds very weird.
Forverts?
Forverts is what I wrote down here. I hope I wrote it down right, but it says Forverts.
Okay.
He went from there.
Forverts, biverts.
So if it was 40, would it be a pervert? He went on from
perverts.
He went from there to working as a publicity director for a movie theater. He had friends who were writers and intellects, but that wasn't something that lent itself to Lipton's work. Now, after marrying and working for his writer wife, he was looking into literature, like becoming like a writer. But always on his mind was sales. And if he was going to be a well-respected poet, he'd have to be marketable. Instead of learning the craft of poetry and spending years developing an authentic voice, he spent his time learning the craft of selling poetry. He wrote a book of poems released as Rainbows at Midnight, but to kind of no acclaim. After his divorce from the crime writer wife...
I think that title sums up how you feel about beat poetry.
Rainbows at Midnight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that lost Lon Chaney movie?
London After Midnight.
No, Rainbows at Midnight. This is a different one.
After his divorce from the crime writer wife, Lipton remarried and moved to 20 Park Avenue in Venice. He was in his mid-50s and was living a comfortable middle-class life in a nice middle-class home on the not-so-great but interesting side of town. Venice was a slum, sure, but a nice oceanside slum with little parks and benches and chess tables and unloved canals and interesting architecture. It was a cool place to live.
It's our slum.
It's our slum. If you could hang out at a slum that wasn't dangerous all the time, then it's livable. And by the mid-50s, creative bohemian types were stirring in the area, and this layabout lifestyle called to the shallow-minded Lipton. Lipton started getting to know the characters that filled a new bohemian scene and started inviting them over to his home. They would all have rousing discussions about art and culture and politics and life, and to read poetry and play music. Some of these bohemians were college students or dropouts, but others were veterans of World War II or Korean War. Some had walked from good-paying jobs in post-war America because after everything the world had went through in the 40s and 50s, keeping a job didn't seem like the most important thing. And as odd as it is to me, Lipton fit into this mindset, and for a while he fit in with these types the way William Burroughs was the much older mentor type to the original Beats on the East Coast. Some of the West Coast Beats looked up to Lipton for the same thing. Like, he was this cool older guy with a house. They didn't have a house, and he was, a nice guy, and he just liked to have people over.
This sounds like a cult waiting to happen.
Kind of. I mean, Charles Manson would swoop in maybe 15 years
He's got
later.
this ranch.
He's kind of small, but I like him. He's small, but wiry, like a rat. Lipton was a smart guy. He was a smart guy. It's undeniable. He was a smart guy, and he was a writer, and they respected him. And he was in awe of these young bohemians, and they, to an extent, were in awe of him, or at least his knowledge. In the mid-50s, in like 1955, 56, I believe, there was a poetry revolution happening, which explains the seed that the Beats kind of grew from. And Lipton was devout in his belief that poetry was meant to be read aloud. Reading poetry to him was like reading music, but not listening to it. I'm not from that mind frame. I like reading poetry. I don't like listening to poetry.
My stance on poetry is it should neither be written nor spoken.
Come back when it's a novel. Come back when it's a comic strip.
Come back when it's a rap song.
Poetry has never seemed cool to write. But there's that movie Patterson with Adam Driver, and I thought, God damn, I'd love to be a bus driver poet. He wasn't the only one that thought this about poetry needing to be read aloud. This was part of the belief of the poetry revolution. Some of the young artists and writers hanging around Lipton were, for example, there was artist Wally Berman, poet and painter Tony Scabella, poet Kenneth Rexroth, and the most prolific of the bunch, bearded, brooding artist and poet and boxcar loader Stuart Perkoff.
I don't know. I've never heard any of these names before in my life.
I'm teaching you. This is a teaching moment.
But I like being one step ahead of you.
That's what the dog's for.
I like being leader of the pack. Ringo is taking my spot. Ringo knows so many beat poets.
Perkoff was a real deal and very much who Lipton wanted to be and wanted to be perceived as. Born in St. Louis in 1930, he split to New York, then moved to Santa Barbara and eventually down to Venice, where he fell into the Venice West scene that was building. He was a frequent of Lipton's home sessions and really grew to respect Lipton and his ideas. And similarly, Lipton really was enamored by Perkoff and would be very encouraging. You're not a person who sometimes writes poems, Lipton would tell him. You're a poet. This is your calling. He was very encouraging to these young people. Around this time, late 50s, poet Allen Ginsberg releases his book of poetry, Howl, and then later his pal Jack Kerouac dumps a bunch of benzodrine into his body and types out the last couple of years of his life, releasing the output as a revolutionary novel, On the Road. Have you read On the Road?
No, I think I read like the first few pages and I was like, when does this sentence end? Like
I had the reaction. Well, I read it in high school. I'm overly dramatic. So I read it. I'm like, the sentence hasn't ended in 3 pages. I got to read the rest of this.
I think we've talked about this before. I don't get poetry.
Yeah,
like
that
it
makes
just
sense.
does not make sense to me. If someone's talking to me and I can hear it, they switch the tone into like I am now reciting a poem. Like my brain just turns off and waits till it's over and they explain it to me.
Yeah.
Like I don't get it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I can't pretend to be like a poetry fan, but I've read poems that I like a lot, but it has to be poetry that it will meet me halfway.
I don't like being made to feel stupid. I like
it's so easy.
If it doesn't rhyme and it doesn't talk about it, like
turtles or yurtles.
I mean, I heard this one. There was a red fish. There was also a blue fish. There were a few other ones.
So On the Road comes out, Howl's out already, and boom, American culture changes. While Los Angeles gets occasional visits from Ginsberg, also from writer muse Anise Nin, who was from Henry Miller's stories.
She's kind of
sexy.
Oh no! I'm thinking, who's the one who wrote The Foundation? Not The Foundation.
Ayn Rand is Fountainhead.
Yeah, not The Foundation.
No.
Who's the one who wrote about the mule and that whole space adventure? Yeah, Ayn Rand. That's the bad one.
That's the bad one.
Anais Nin.
Good one.
Good one.
Yeah, good. You're learning feminism.
There are two types of women.
So yeah, Anise Nin would come by Los Angeles sometimes. Sometimes Kerouac, Gregory Corso. Sometimes Ginsberg was in with Lipton. They were pals, I guess. The Venice scene still, after all this, like we are suddenly getting more visits from the big beat writers. Los Angeles is still very detached from the beat scene that is big in San Francisco. Because of that, the beat scene that grew in Venice became very insular. While lawyer Alphonse Matthews and Big Daddy Nord were the face of the gas house, it's said that the true man behind the first beatnik community space in Venice was in fact Lawrence Lipton. The scene was being referred to as Venice West, which was not Lipton's phrase, but he championed it. Whenever he'd make appearances on radio programs or anytime he'd have his voice heard, he'd be boasting about what was happening in Venice West. His salesmanship was starting the show, and brother, that was a no-no in this so sincere beat scene. And one of the people who took issue with this
we don't want to make money, man.
Yeah.
I'm still
hip. Yeah. You're actually going for more Manson now. We don't need money, man, but do you have any?
The Manson family was like the missing link, the pre-man between hippies and beats.
Yeah, between hippies and beats, there were a failed musician who had no problem stabbing people to death.
That's like the bumper sticker of like the crouched over beatnik.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, there's the hippie smoking a doob, and in between it's Manson just stabbing or doing his dance.
Wow. He's doing his weird dance and all the girls are stabbing for him.
But I cut you off. Who is it?
Stuart Perkoff, the very sincere poet, does not like that Lipton is so good at selling this scene or the sale of this scene. Lipton's phoniness was becoming very apparent. Anise Nin would complain that she'd go over to Lipton's house and he'd play records of people reading poetry instead of letting poets who were there read their work. Lipton was performative and wanted everyone to recognize him as an intellectual and a shaman. Perkoff was the real deal, and Lipton's shameless promotion of a genuine art form turned him sour towards Lipton. That being said, Perkoff was a Bukowski type, or I guess Bukowski is a Perkoff type, as far as making his whole life getting drunk, high, laid, and unemployed, and a lifelong cycle of sad. So he's no hero either. I don't want anyone to think like, well, Perkoff, what a cool guy.
Can we have nobody anymore then? I can't
can't have any of my toys.
I can't look up to the guy who tried to commercialize beat poetry 5 years after everyone lost interest. Who do I have left, Greg? The guy from The Hungry Eye I was talking about before.
Mort Saul. Mort Saul. Who do I have left?
Greg,
Mort Saul?
I swear to God, if you tell me about that article you read about Mort Saul, I don't want to hear it. Let me have Mort Saul.
Here's a sentence that's never been said ever before. Did you hear the news about Mort Saul?
Unless that sentence ends with, he died 40 years ago. You didn't
Guys, sit down. It's a Mort Saul.
You didn't read that BuzzFeed article's 10 reasons why we can't laugh at Mort Saul anymore?
Hey, we're not here to bash Mort Saul.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Fed up with the gas house and Lipton's house, Stuart Perkoff took a big swing by purchasing a storefront at 7 Dudley Avenue. This coffee shop
what?
Oh, sorry. Stuart Perkoff and a friend bought a coffee shop, and it was going to be the new beat scene.
And what was the name of the street?
7 Dudley Avenue.
7 Deadly Avenue?
Dudley, like a British person named like Dudley Moore.
Okay, like Harry Potter's mean stepbrother.
Like his
his
cousin. They're not steps.
Yeah.
No one's married.
Well, he lives under the steps, so it's his stepbrother.
When one of you is below the steps and one of you is above the steps, you count as steps.
So that's what a step is.
You just have to clarify at court what it means.
I thought it was called 7 Deadly Sins, 7 Deadly Avenue.
No, that would be clever.
That would be.
Why would a poet come up with something clever? That's too commercial, man. Dig it.
This shouldn't make sense, man.
The coffee shop would be the new gathering place for the beat scene and would be called the Venice West Cafe. The year was 1958, and the Venice West Cafe would become the place that the scene thrived in, the meeting grounds. But it would not be in 1958 and would not be under the direction of Stuart Perkoff. Perkoff would only run this space for 6 months before being forced to sell it after it failed to really take off.
Sell out.
Perkoff would continue to write poems and be a drug addict, doing time in jail for possession, opening up a bookshop in Frisco, coming back to Venice in the 70s, and then dying soon after. That's basically some of the rest of his life. He has a book called...
Sounds like he did everything a beat poet wanted to do. Opened a bookstore in San Francisco, died of alcohol.
I mean, I'm trying to think of the other beat poets that died young and like, yep, that's it. Neil Cassidy, check. Jack Kerouac, check. But he has a book of poems called Suicide Room that I hear is actually pretty good if you like poetry. The Venice West Cafe would take off after the publication of the 1959 novel Holy Barbarians, written by Lawrence Lipton. It was his On the Road, and although I have not read it, the reviews and its reputation makes me believe it's not wholly accurate or well written. I read some modern reviews of this book. I didn't find any reviews of the time it came out, but it reads like, from the snippets I've read, it reads like a narc's falsified report about being in a beatnik cafe. It's so cartoonish in its depiction of the scene and the poets and the artists who fill the space. It's said to be shallow and dull, and because it stands as one of the only novels depicting that scene at the time, it's made the Venice beat scene seem very vapid and stupid. Well, after Holy Barbarians, he became a champion of the sexual revolution, writing the 1965 book The Erotic Revolution, an affirmative view of the new morality. And although we both laugh and it sounds gross, it actually takes pretty progressive stance.
It's actually pretty hot.
Every sentence I read, suddenly I was just wearing less clothes. It has a really progressive stance for 1965. In the book, he wants to repeal all laws regulating premarital sex, make legal marriage optional, repeal all laws making homosexuality illegal, repeal all the so-called unnatural laws regarding the sexual act, make contraceptives legal everywhere and free to low-income groups, make all abortions legal and free to those unable to pay. So, like, not...
This is so hot.
This dude's so progressive.
But wait, make marriage optional? What?
Make legal marriage optional?
What does that mean?
I don't
Isn't
know.
Isn't it always optional to get married?
Yeah, that one I thought I knew what I meant when I wrote it down, but I guess like
does that mean
optional? But like maybe like you have to get married if you want to do this stuff. You have to get married. You have to be a legally married couple if you want to do this certain stuff. And I guess that is saying it's optional. You can just be like a couple. I don't know. This is my understanding of it.
I don't know what this swinger's talking about.
He continued to write essays and articles for literary magazines. He continued writing poems and taking stances, but he was never really respected for his intellect. And he's only really known for one thing: being the father of James Lipton.
Okay. Are you serious?
Yeah, dead
wow. Because you said Lipton so many times, and I was like, gotta squeeze in a James Lipton joke here.
Gotta squeeze in a Lipton IT joke, am I right?
I kept thinking that's Brisk, baby, but like, that's not Lipton. That's Lipton, baby. You know, I could see that. James Lipton had a very beat aura to him.
Yeah, I could see that, even though he wore a suit like a dork. He was a cool beat guy. And
he's a sellout like his dad.
Anytime he was on Conan, I thought he was beat. But also, like, he sounds a little bit like a deadbeat dad. Like, this was a child in his second marriage, of which he had 5. Anyways.
That's Brisk, baby. That's what Moyle says. That's Brisk, baby.
A baby screaming, a bunch of family members being like, did he do it right? That's Brisk, baby. As for the Venice West Cafe...
Then he runs through the wall like the Kool-Aid man.
As for the Venice West Cafe, it is remembered quite fondly, although reading about it, it sounds like an afterthought of the Beat Generation coffee houses and more of a precursor to the hippie folk movement. The gas house closed in 1960... What?
No, again, this is like the missing link.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah, for sure.
It's the Manson, the Manson link.
It opens too late for one and too early for the other. Yeah. The gas house closed...
The L.A. Meekley of
podcasts.
Well, we're the L.A. Meekley of podcasts.
Yeah.
It's the L.A. Meekley of poetry. I mean, I guess we are kind of the L.A. Meekley of poetry.
Poetry coffee houses, yeah. It is, yeah, L.A. Meekley. The gas house closed in 1962, and the Venice West Cafe stayed open until 1966, but suffered from the same problem: noise-hating neighbors. Many of the storefronts around the cafe remained empty because
the real heroes of this story,
people who hate bongos. Many of the storefronts around the cafe remained empty because nobody wanted to open up a shop next to an all-night bongo party. They were given an eviction notice as the area slowly became gentrified and morphed into the Venice we see now, which is to say, still weird and grimy and not gentrified at all. My 2 favorite beatniks, however, do meet in Venice in November of 1976 at the Beyond Baroque Poetry Workshop. That is where a moody cowboy named John Doe, or I guess nicknamed John Doe, an angsty goth poet, Exene Cervenka, would meet, and a few years later would form the excellent band X. And a lot of, like, the way I think about beatniks and beats, like, that I used to think beatniks, you could only write poetry, but like, you could be a punk band. The Zephyr skate team, who would put the Z in Dogtown and the Z Boys, were angsty little beatniks. Instead of writing poems, they just would skate and surf and get high and not have jobs. Like, that's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
They're free from society. That's basically what beat was like. We reject all the formalities of everything that became. Jack Kerouac walked so Jay Adams could surf. So that's basically the beat scene that happened in Venice in the late 50s, early 60s. Memorialized my favorite in the movies that would happen. Like we talked about before, like Bucket of Blood or the Beatniks or Night Tide. We'd see like a jazz cafe and something like that. That's the kind of, this is the scene. That's the way I like to remember, or that's the way I like to think about the Venice scene.